Well, hello everybody. We're just waiting for people to join. So while we're doing that, can I ask you all to mute your microphones if you haven't done so already? That'd be fantastic.
It would be wonderful to know where everybody is speaking from as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you could put that in the chat, maybe just which part of the region of the world you're from, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
And also maybe why you decided to join today. What piqued your interest in joining this webinar today?
Yeah, that would be. Now, what questions can we answer for you? That would be really good to know.
Oh no, that would throw us off our script, Fay. That'd be horrible.
No, but it would be really good to know what would they like answers for, because that's why they were here.
Yeah.
Why they're here. So we'd love to know that. So yep, lovely. So it'd be great to read out some of the comments, Carol, if you feel up to doing that.
Yes, certainly. Debbie Greenwood says, I love to hear different perspectives and ideas. She's from sunny Bournemouth on the south coast of the UK.
Fantastic.
We've got Justine McGrath from Dublin and Ireland, come for a refresher.
Beautiful.
And Anna-Marie Abdo from Massachusetts, about an hour from Boston. And Sabrina from Buenos Aires, Dougie Brown from Leeds, UK, and Sheila Connor from Seattle, and Nicola Latham from the UK, Elizabeth from Chicago, and Mary Beth from Austin.
That's great. Really nice selection of people from all over the world.
Yeah, brilliant. So I'm very conscious of our time, and also the time that people have put aside to come and listen to us today, Fay. Do you want to just talk a little bit about your background and before I introduce myself?
My name is Fay. I'm speaking to you from Beirut, Lebanon today. Fay Niewiadomski. I've been in the academic space and in the business space for almost 4 decades. So that gives you an idea. I've been working with the emotions and behaviors profile for about 15 years. And I focus very much on developing leadership teams and leadership communication. And the reason I put so much energy into that is that I believe leaders have the greatest impact on their organizations and on the people who they work with, their decisions, their behaviors. And business EQ really gives me the tools I need to be able to make a difference, and more importantly, to demonstrate that difference in very practical and measurable terms, as we will discover later today. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I'm an occupational psychologist. I'm one of the psychologists that originally designed the EBW back nearly 20 years ago. My background is originally in accountancy and then various psychology degrees. I ended up teaching research methodology and stats at the University of London, and actually part of my role is still to supervise research projects. So for example, at the moment we've got an ongoing research project with University of London looking at fast-track graduates in the police force and looking at how emotional intelligence impacts on their success. So my role is really not only in the development of the EBW, but also supporting partners like Fay to use the tools and the assessments with their clients. So let's crack on and sort of introduce the EBW and what the objectives of this session's about. So there's really sort of three objectives that Fay and I thought would be useful to discuss today. One is what do we mean by business intelligence, and why is it so important to focus on it, and how does it make a significant difference to leaders and teams' performance? And then briefly explore some of the business EQ toolkits that we publish to develop sort of data and deep analytical strategies to deliver actionable insights. And then finally, to give you a bit more evidence around why focusing on business EQ actually makes a difference to the bottom line. And Fay's got a fantastic case study that she worked with an organisation for over a year, and what the actual financial impact was of that work that she did. So let's start by looking at, if you like, the difference between emotional intelligence and business EQ, or what we mean by emotional intelligence in the workplace. So if I just show you the next slide, you've probably seen this before, or certainly slides similar to this that describes emotional intelligence and what we mean by emotional intelligence. So with most people, emotional intelligence is made up of understanding how their emotions affect their behaviors. Actually, when you dive deeper into it, you realize it's made up of two sort of competing ideas. One is your intrapersonal intelligence, which is about understanding how your emotional behaviors or your emotions affect your behavior. And then for us, because we're focusing on emotional intelligence in the workplace, how your behaviors impact on your performance in the workplace. The second part of it, which for many people is a lot harder, is the interpersonal intelligence, which is about awareness of others and how their emotions affect their behaviors. And then more importantly, how do you manage that relationship to improve their performance? So whether they're people who report to you or people that you work with, like your peers or fellow teammates, what can you do to improve your relationship with them that in turn influences their performance in the workplace? So that's
I add a comment here, Stephen.
Yeah, sure.
What I find that creates a really deep insight here is when people realize not only that to become aware of which emotions drive their behaviors, but to recognize that they actually have the power of choice of what to do in response to their own emotions, and the power of choice in how they will interact with others. And that changes the entire dynamic of how interactions happen at work. And this model captures that so well.
Yeah, I think for most people, emotional intelligence sounds really simple. You know, you've got this intrapersonal and you've got the interpersonal concepts, awareness of how you are, awareness of how it affects your behavior, awareness of how that affects your performance, what you can do about it. And then the second part, as I said, the interpersonal bit, you know, awareness of others, how you work with them, how you form your relationships, and in turn, how does that affect their performance in the workplace? The difficulty is, where do you put your focus? Which emotional behaviors, which performance indicators do you focus on? Which one's going to make a difference to the bottom line? And as Fay says, once you build up that awareness, then you've got choice about where you direct your focus. But for many people, it's really difficult to understand where to go, where to put their focus. And that's where we started with the EBW, to look at the literature, and I'm going back 20 odd years ago, look at the literature that then describes what are the key emotional behaviors that people should be focusing on to make a difference in the workplace. And when we looked at the literature, we found that actually there were 7 key emotional behaviors or scales that consistently predict performance in the workplace. So the first one we recognized was decisiveness. So how do you make decisions? What drives your decisions? And more importantly, what makes you feel confident with your decision making? What makes you feel like you want to take responsibility for the decisions? How do you take responsibility for the decision? What drives your decision making behavior? Then there's motivation. What makes you enthusiastic? What makes you excited about the work you do? Why do you get excited about it? And how does that affect how you feel about the work? How optimistic you feel? How positive do you feel?
or what risks you're willing to take or not take. The thing is, we hear these words in business like decision making and motivation, but we don't realize there's a very wide range of behaviors that are possible. So on the one side, you have the optimism and the risk taking, but on the expectation that things will be positive. But on the other side, you have aversion to risk and the concern about what obstacles might get in the way when it comes to motivation. And that changes a lot in terms of what behaviors, what outcomes can occur. So the next one is, go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, influence. Yeah, that need to have influence. So whether we have people who strongly have a strong drive to influence others, or whether people are quite happy for people to come to them, and influence them. So it's almost similar to the sort of introvert-extrovert scale, but it's about that emotional need that some people have to push their view. And at the extreme levels of that scale is to actually not listen to other people because they're almost competitive, that their view is more important. And then there's adaptability, which is, given the change that we've all been through over the last 2 or 3 years, how flexible are we? How adaptable are we to new situations?
I'd love to give an example of something I'm working on right now, Stephen, about adaptability. I'm working with a large multinational global organization that has just gone through a merger and acquisition. And the two organizations that are trying to merge or that are in the process come from very, very different cultural backgrounds. And it's interesting to see the dynamic. People, and I'm referring specifically to adaptability, as later on you will find out, people who are more open to variety and change are the people who are actually building bridges and reaching across to speak to the other side, to make accommodations, to try and understand. And the people who are on the other side of adaptability, which we will explain a little bit more about, people who are more comfortable with what they're used to, with the traditional way of doing things, are still very, very cautious. So in a very large multi-billion-dollar project like this, you see the leaders willing or reluctant to approach one another because of adaptability, each one standing on their side and thinking that they are right, or they're the ones who have to have their way because their way has proven to be successful. I can almost predict in sequence of adaptability who is going first, second, and third. And that's really, of course, it's not that simple, but it's quite a predictable and interesting thing to watch and to see how it melts the ice and brings people together.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about adaptability is that we all tend to think we're more adaptable than we are. And the big factor is about how much control we have. So when you talk to senior leaders, and they often predict that they are far more adaptable than the EBW suggests. And the reason is because when they think about how flexible they are, they're always in control of the change program or the transformational project. It's very different when we're asked to change the way we're behaving or the way we manage ourselves. And that, of course, then fits into things like empathy, which is another emotional behavior that we measure in the EBW assessment. So that's pretty much what it says on the tin. It's about how sensitive are we to other people's perspectives? How much consideration do we give to others? Are we very task focused or are we very people focused? And then conscientiousness, when you first read that, most people go, well, how does that fit with emotional intelligence? Well, the big thing for us was building a cross-cultural model of emotional intelligence that worked across the workplace, doesn't matter which region of the world you're in, was to understand not only people's drivers for the way they plan things and deliver on things, but also what are the hidden rules that people have? What are the cultural rules that people have in different regions of the world, and how does that fit their comfort zones? So if I turned up to this webinar today, 20 minutes late, how would people think about that? What would they think about the fact that I was late to an event that I'd helped organize? So different organizations in different, so whether you work in the financial sector or the educational sector, will have different hidden rules about how one should behave. And if people don't reflect that behavior back at you, it can make you feel uncomfortable or okay with it, depending to some degree on your resilience, which is another area that we obviously measure in the EBW assessment. We measure people's mental toughness, so how they cope with being, in changing situations, but also how they express that. So do they show their emotions? Do they wear their heart on their sleeve, or do they keep a sense of emotional control where they don't show what they're feeling? Now, I can talk about this at length as Fay could, but what we thought would be quite exciting or interesting for you guys to do is just to think about where you might score on just 3 of these scales. Obviously, we haven't got time to go through all of them with you today, but one of the things we do when we're providing the EBW assessment back is get people to think about where they might score. So if I just talk about decisiveness for a moment. So decisiveness is all about how you make decisions and what drives your decisions and how comfortable you feel with decision making. So if you score on the right hand side, so when I say right hand side, I kind of mean 7 and above. People like to make decisions, they like to drive decisions, they like to be in control of the decisions, and the closer they get up to 10, the more comfortable they feel with the decision making, being in control of the decisions, and they're happy to make decisions, say, without a lot of information. Whereas people on the left hand side, actually people like me, like to make considered decisions. They like to think about their decisions before they're prepared to take responsibility for them. So as a psychologist, that works really well for me, because I'm often asked to go into organization and make recommendations based on my academic knowledge, my commercial experience, and the research that I'm doing in that organization. I'm not expected just to go in there and make a quick decision based on what's ever flying across the desk at the time. However, as a senior partner at EBW Global, I have to operate on the right-hand side at times, because otherwise we miss opportunities. I have to make quick decisions. Fay, you're going to jump in.
I was just going to say that I'm not going to go into a detailed description yet. Yeah. We'll do that on the next slide, but I don't want to prejudice people yet. So maybe people can figure out, maybe take a guess where they think they might be. Yeah. So did you want to tell them about the left side here, or shall we go to the next?
I'll just quickly point out, and just another bit is, so if, say for example, you scored 8, what we're interested in is what happens when you're out of your comfort zone. So do you go more to the left, or do you go more to the right? So when you're out of your comfort zone, how does your behavior change? How does your emotions hijack you? Do you actually make quicker decisions, go more to the right, or do you go more to the left? And that's where the richness of the EBW starts becoming really interesting for developing leaders and teams. And just to put some stats to it, because as I said, I'm a psychometrician, it's just to remember that if you're saying you score a 10, you're in 2% of the population who score there. And that's really significant, because if I got 100 people and put them in a bar or a restaurant, only 2 people would score a 10, would show the behaviors of what it's like to be a 10. And so those end areas, the 8s, the 9s and the 10s and the 3s and the 2s and 1s, they really are different to how most people behave, because it's such a small percentage of people who score there. Let's look at some of the other scales. Just you want to talk about motivation?
Yeah. I'd like to invite people to do a self-assessment. Just if you have something handy where you can write or you can type something in, I'd like you to see where you think you are on these first 3, on decisiveness, motivation, and influence. So Stephen already described the decisiveness. If you're on the left, you're someone who's going to be cautious. You want to think about it. So on the right, you're going to want to move quickly. And in the middle, it will depend on how comfortable you are in the area of expertise, or depending on who you believe is more qualified to make that decision. So give yourself a number on that. On motivation, if you're on the right, you're quite an optimistic, high energy person. You put a lot of passion in your work. The more to the right you are, the more you focus almost all your energy and passion into what you're doing. If you're on the left, If you're closer to the 1, 2, 3, you're someone who is going to be more cautious. You're going to be someone who is going to consider the risks and possibly look at your work in a more dispassionate way. You're not going to be, you're not putting your heart and soul in it. However, it doesn't mean that you won't be methodical and systematic in the way you approach the work. And if you're in the middle, you're going to be a bit selective. There are things where you will want to put a lot of energy into it, and other things where you might be less inclined to be so energetic. So where do you think you are? If you're optimistic and expect things to go well, you're probably going to be more to the right. If you are cautious and want to be careful about what you're doing, you're going to be more to the left. And of course, in the middle, you're in between. On the third one here, it's influence. And that's about, again, we touched on it briefly. Stephen mentioned that if you're on the right, you're someone who really is very concerned about getting your idea across. You want to be heard, you want to be seen, you want your ideas to be adopted. And if you're on the left, you may present your thoughts, you may present your ideas, but sort of on a take it or leave it basis. You're not invested in having people accept your idea. And in the middle, again, you would tend to be selective. If there are things that matter to you, you will want to be seen and heard, and you will want to get those ideas across. But again, it's not going to be full time. So give yourself a score on these. And something interesting to do, if we go back to decisiveness, we spent quite a bit of time. How would you describe someone whom you felt was very decisive? What words would you use to describe a very decisive person? What would you say about them? You can write some of these in the chat. What would a decisive person look like to you, and how would you describe them? This is an interesting perspective shifter for people. So, okay, controlling, yes. Any other words come to mind when you think of someone very much on the right? Commanding, yes. Someone who's assertive. Depend on somebody who's courageous. Okay, in the interest of our time limitation, somebody who would risk talking. Now, what would be the opposite of these words that we have in the chat here? If you were to come up with the opposite words, controlling, what is the opposite of controlling? Somebody enthusiastic. And what's the opposite of enthusiastic? What's the opposite of controlling? What's the opposite of courage? Laid back, there you go. So it's quite a surprise to people when I ask, weak, there you go. When I ask people to put the words that are the descriptors that they believe describe the side that they are on, they write these things down. And then I ask them to look at, let's say these words would be good descriptions for a 9 or 10. And the opposites would be the words that come to mind when a 9 or a 10 looks at a 1 or a 2. So how does that affect our dynamic at work? What does it do to our relationships? And how does the 1 and 2 describe the 9 or 10? And how does that impact the dynamic of relationships and willingness to cooperate with one another at work? So those are the kinds of things we explore when we get into understanding our relationships, not only with ourselves and how we view ourselves, but our relationships with other people and how they view us and how we view them and what that does to our choices at work. Stephen?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how you bring in the interrelationships between the scales and how important that is.
So supposing we had someone, if we go to the other slide and we look at someone who's on the right for motivation and decisiveness and influence, you know, that person would be someone who would be quite a fast moving, very commanding type of leader. And how would that impact the rest of the organization if we looked at adaptability? Supposing adaptability for that person who was very commanding, wanted to take control, was on the left. Let's say adaptability was left-sided, which means they wanted things done the way they were used to. Or empathy on the left as well, where they weren't very aware of how other people were feeling and thinking.
And I think the other bit is, you know, if you take it back to that interpersonal piece that we started with, how do they empower other people when they're
or not empower them?
Or not empower them, yeah. So
exactly.
that's the kind of questions that start getting to the really, how do you change people's behaviour and performance in the workplace?
So
and how far can you go with those leadership behaviours to change the performance of others?
There is a certain extent to which you can change, but now for how long and for what purpose? And that is what the power of choice does. When a leader becomes aware of what range they have, they understand that they have a choice depending on the context, depending on who they're interacting with, depending on the situation and the purpose that they want to achieve. And a leader who wants to empower the members of their team, a leader who is on the right, may choose to be a tool in decisiveness in a particular meeting because he or she wants to encourage the members of their team to present their points of view, to speak up, to feel encouraged to say what they have to say. So we can choose to be a different place on the line to where we would normally be comfortable in order to achieve a business goal, in order to achieve the development of another individual, or whatever other business objective we may have. And that's why business EQ has a completely different set of objectives than EQ in general.
Yeah, it's about focusing on those emotional behaviours that makes a difference to performance in the workplace. And actually, what we did is when we developed the EBW assessment back in the late 1990s, we rapidly became aware of the need for looking at teams and how teams work together. And certainly, you know, in the early 2000s, there was some interesting research by people like Hackman that looked at the drivers of teams' performance. And so what we were interested in doing at that point is to look at how a leader interacts with their teams and what are the areas that they need to focus on to drive successful team performance. So not only the individual dynamics or the team dynamics, so how people make decisions, how they motivate others, how they influence, how they adapt, but what are the other drivers that actually predict team performance? And actually the literature was quite clear on this. There's 6 drivers of successful or effective team performance. One is the vision. What's the vision for the team? Do people understand what the vision is? Do they agree with it? More importantly, what do they trust people in the team? Do they understand what drives their behavior? Do they trust them to do what they're going to do? And then there's things like identity, which is about why do people want to belong to this team as opposed to another team? So if you're the ops director, is your loyalty to the senior management team you belong to, or is it to the operations division that you're responsible for? So when you're asked to make a headcount cut, where's your accountability? Where's your loyalty? And then there's commitment, which is about, it's like motivation, but it's actually more about, do you trust the people beside you? Do you think they've got the right skill set to deliver when things get tough? Do you have that sense of belief that you can still push through when things get difficult for your team? And that kind of comes from the literature out of sports psychology, where you constantly see teams that are successful playing right to the end whistle of the game, that they still, even if they're losing, they still have that commitment to deliver and change the game around. And that's what we're looking for in professional teams as well. And then, of course, as you can see there, there's communication and how well people work together. But the communication bit is also about psychological safety, which is, do people feel confident enough? Do they trust people enough to give them powerful feedback when things aren't going well, or even when things are going well, to reward them and say, hey, you've done a great job there. Fay, I can see you just...
Yeah, I just wanted to say that working in complex organizations, especially those with matrix structures, even identifying the team, who is the team, is a challenge. But what I have found to be a real game changer is the difference between cohesion and consensus. Teams that are successful, are really successful, have cohesion, which means they are clear on those drivers. They know where the team is going. They have a purpose. They trust one another to the extent where they're willing to challenge one another. That psychological safety you mentioned. They're willing to disagree. And that is what differentiates the teams with high cohesion, which means they're willing to play to the end. They're willing to take risks together. They feel safe to disagree with the leader, versus the consensus where they want to comply with corporate requirements or to be compliant with policy. And their performance is very different. When it's just consensus driven, because some people will hold back because they may feel that it's disloyal to disagree with the team. They don't want to rock the boat. And so they go along, and those teams tend to deliver much poorer results than the teams who actually play hard and keep going and trust one another, because they know that they can move ahead and can disagree and still be okay with one another.
And that's where the team assessment starts, because it gives the team and the leaders of the team a benchmark of where they are in comparison to others. So the assessment works by not only assessing everybody in the team, but also comparing their responses to the team assessment to other successful teams. So what you end up getting is a linear assessment, where the closer you get to the green areas, the more successful the team is likely to be. And as you can see here, this example that I pulled up, most of the team is in the orange area, and there's a couple there that are in the red area, which means that that's a strong warning sign that there's some issues around in the team. But what's interesting is about the range of scores that underpin that score. So what the team assessment tells you is where people are scoring and how they feel about these drivers are successful, or how successful they feel the team is.
The wider that range, the less the cohesion, because people thought they were in agreement with one another. And it's very shocking and surprising to them when they realize, they say something like, we're a very good team, we work very well together. And then the shock comes when they see this wide range of scores. Someone who is a 2 or a 1, and then you have someone that could be even more extreme, could be an 8 within that same team.
So if you just rely on the sort of average score, the 6, looking at vision, where in this example I happen to know from the case study that it was a leader who was scoring the team's vision as an 8, which means that he's basically, in this case it was a he, not a she, he was basically feeling that the team agreed with the vision, they were all on board with it, they understood it, and they thought it was fantastic, was his general impression of it. But of course you've got people in that team who are scoring 4 and 5, which means they might understand it, but they don't necessarily agree with it. They don't agree with the direction of travel. So straight away you've got a starting point for whatever team intervention you want to do. So whether it's a one-day sort of, here you go, what do you want to do about it, or a longer program, a longer team coaching program, to decide how to make this team a high performance team. And the way that Fay has used it and other EBW partners is actually to look at each of those areas. So whether that be, I think the case study you're going to talk about, Fay, is a 3-day intervention that you did where you got all the team off site, wasn't it? And you focused on, where is the team now? What are the benchmarks? Where do they need to get to? What would it look like to be a successful team? So if they were scoring 5, what does 8 on vision look like? And more importantly, how would they know that if they scored an 8 on vision, that was going to make a difference to their performance, and importantly to their stakeholders' performance.
Exactly.
And then gone. Sorry, Faye.
That was the biggest thing for them to be able to demonstrate in metrics and in clear figures what a difference it would make if the team achieved that cohesion and if they actually moved up the scale in all those team performance drivers. Yeah. So we looked at individual change, we looked at team dynamic changes, measuring those drivers, and we looked at impact on stakeholders, which was actually the business results and the financial performance.
Yeah, and I know you did it initially, or in the particular case study we're going to address today, as a sort of 4-day event with then ongoing coaching after that. But places like the UNHCR, they actually do it as a 9-month program. So they take each of these areas as a team coaching session each month with homework for them to do in between the different sessions. So it's constantly focusing on the emotion and behaviours that they need to change in terms of team dynamics, in terms of the performance of the team, to make a difference to the bottom line. And in their case, their stakeholders are, in the UN HCR, is the refugees. So that's a really, their stakeholders is how do their refugees' lives improve? So it's key performance metrics that they're evaluating. But the big thing about it is actually looking at that team dynamics, isn't it, Faye? This is where you found the power. And what we're able to do with the EBW assessment is build up EQ maps to show how the individuals in those teams work together to make a difference to those areas like vision, like trust, like identity, and how much psychological effort they're required to make with each other to actually make a difference to the behaviour of themselves, the team, and their stakeholders. So here you can see a map being developed, and how much effort people in the team have to make with each other. And people often get confused by what we mean by psychological efforts. We've got a quick graphic there just to present that to you. So really what we're talking about is not about the amount of effort, but actually the awareness that you need to have of other people's emotional behaviour, so you can work with them despite the fact that they might feel and think and experience the world very differently to yourself. And that's the emotional intelligent bit. It's also the hardest bit to do, because as we call it, the EQ paradox. When you most need your emotional intelligence, your business EQ, is generally when you've got the least resources or the least motivation to do anything about it. And I think this is where you're going to discuss, aren't you, Faye, with your EQ map from the case study?
Yes, this is an actual case study of the empathy map for a real team. And what I do is I actually give them a blank map like this, but all gray lines. And I ask them to use the colored pens, the red, the orange, the blue, and the green, to map out their relationships with the other people in the team. So if there was a red line, it means they perceive a huge psychological effort is necessary for them to get along with one another. And then when we actually reveal the map itself from the report, Mary Beth was asking, would she see a report? Probably we will send you links where you can see samples of these reports, Mary Beth. But this is one of the things. This is a page from a report, and people are surprised because most people want to be very polite and very proper, and so the lines they draw are very rarely red or orange. But when they did see this, and this was a team where no two people, I think there were only 2 of the same nationality. Everybody else was a different nationality on this team. And this came as a big surprise to them. What was going on is that this team was not only newly formed, but it was a team that now had a huge mandate to transform the business culture, which is, again, we can go into a long discussion of what that really means. But
probably more time than we got time for today.
Exactly. But this was shocking to them, because they never came out and said, you know something, I really have an issue with this person. What had happened is they had assumed that people had emotions that they were projecting on them, that people were feeling or not feeling what they thought. And so no one had ever opened up and said, yes, this is how I really feel. This is what has upset me. And the breakthrough in this team came on the last day of the workshop when we were addressing empathy. And we stopped. The timing was right, the momentum was right, and people's predisposition was right. And people actually shared what they were feeling, what they were concerned about, how they felt misunderstood in terms of what their intention was and what pressure they were under. And it was just like, you know, the ice just melted. And we were able to have a conversation that was constructive. And people were saying, I didn't know that that's what you were going through. I thought you were just imposing this on us. And the conversation shifted from what we were feeling to what we were going to do about it, so that we could have a proper working relationship and achieve the big goals. And the question I asked them at the end of this session was, what is it that you can do for which you do not need permission? And then they came up, well, we can actually ask each other questions. We can talk about how we're feeling. We can ask for support. All the pragmatic things that are not written into policies and procedures, the things that people need to be able to work together and produce results. And we did have results. At the end of the session, we set up 4 follow-up meeting points, which we call roundtables, and we check in and see how people are progressing. And we had established the metrics and the KPIs, what we call the baseline, when we first started. Mm. A year later, we measured the results, and everybody was extremely surprised because this was happening during the COVID lockdown.
Let me just pull up the slide there, Fay, because I think you've got them. So what you're able to do with the assessment is measure at point A and point A, but what Fay's talking about is the additional metrics that when you go through the process that we recommend that you take. And these are the ones from the actual case study you were talking about, Fay.
That's right. These were the actual results that the team achieved in terms of financial performance. They exceeded their 2020 year-to-date targets by $3 million. They missed a couple, but only by 1.3% in Q4 because of COVID. They reduced their inventory by $700,000 more than they had targeted. Their overall performance was better than their peers in the same region and the same market. And then when it comes to cohesion as a team, their organizational health survey had a record response of 85% response rate. And the scores that they looked at, like engagement, innovation, inclusion, ethics, you can see that the smallest improvement was +3 points. And the average score was all above 75%, which they hadn't had before. They haven't had that in years. And this particular team was highly motivated. They were responsible for a massive region of the world, Europe, Middle East, Africa. And they created a dashboard looking at what it cost them to go to market, what it cost them to acquire customers. And they performed so well that as a result of this, I was invited to replicate this whole program with several other teams in maybe 5 different regions of the world. So yes, it makes a difference. And what makes a difference is people. Mm. When people change behavior, that is what culture transformation is. It's not anything else but people behaving differently. And they don't need permission to make better choices in how they will manage their relationships. Stephen?
Yeah, I was just going to say it. I think what makes the EBW is that it's a relatively straightforward approach that gives you the framework and the benchmarks to give people permission to change their behavior and to understand how to change their behavior. And in times when we have so little time to change our behavior and focus on that, it gives you the focus of where you want to put your energy to make a difference, not only to your performance, but for the performance of others that either work with you or report to you. So I'm hoping in that very brief whirlwind of information that we've given you in the last 45 minutes plus, it gives you some insight into the objectives that we set ourselves. One was to explain why we believe focusing on business EQ rather than emotional intelligence will make a significant difference to leaders and teams' performance. But also to show you how we use the EBW assessments and toolkits. I appreciate it was only a brief synopsis, but just to give you that deep analytical and data-driven actionable insights that make a difference to the bottom line. And then using, in this case, the case study that Fay presented, some examples of where it has actually significantly made a difference to the bottom line and what that difference looks like. So thank you very much for your time today. If you've got any questions, we'd be happy to try and attempt to answer them in the last sort of 10 minutes of the time we booked with you today. If you'd want to talk to Fay and I in a bit more detail, Fay will be more than happy to talk about her experience, what she does with EBW, how she works with it, and what she can offer. And for myself, if you're interested in knowing more about the EBW assessments or getting certified, then please get in touch either with myself directly or with the support team at EBW Global. So happy to open the floor to any questions that people might want to ask in the last few minutes.
I put in my email if anyone would like to send in questions. I'm happy to do that.
Okay.
So,
hi, Stephen. There are some questions in the chat.
Okay, sorry, I haven't been looking at the chat. I've been
could
so
you read the questions out, or?
Yeah, I'm just
there's a question from Mary Beth. Will we see the assessment itself and assessment results in addition to conceptual framework and applied examples we're discussing?
Yeah.
The other question is,
if I just deal with that. So Mary Beth, happy to show you a bit more about the EBW assessment and the reports that come out of it and the toolkit. If you want to book a time with me, I can spend a bit more time explaining that to you.
And the other question is, if I draw a red and my counterpart a green, how does that show up?
That depends on the individuals involved and how they've assessed in the EBW assessment. So it depends on why you're putting a red and your counterpart is putting a green in, is the answer. I can't tell you exactly how that would turn out because it would depend on what the output is of the EBW assessment. Any other questions there?
Yes, Stephen, there's a question about disclosure and psychological safety from Sheila Connor.
Let me just flick back and see if I can find that.
I think
that has to do with the lines, when you draw the lines and you share them out.
Could I answer that question,
Yeah,
Stephen?
sure. Go for it, Fay.
When we do have such a team workshop, we actually negotiate with everyone and we agree on the level of disclosure and the level of confidentiality everyone is comfortable with. Yeah. And we do not disclose anything that people are not willing to have disclosed. So for example, we might talk about left-sided, right-sided. We talk about colors, which people are okay to discuss because we obviously need to solve the communication problems that emerge from those differences. What is interesting is that by the end of the process, people voluntarily tell each other their scores, but we do not push them there. We do not send profiles of people to one another. So we negotiate very carefully with the leader of the team and with the individual members of the team, whether or not they're comfortable to disclose and how far they're willing to go for disclosure. Probably something we didn't mention in the process, there's a lot of one-on-one private feedback as well, which is not shared with everybody in order to prepare for the team dynamics. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question, Sheila. Any other questions?
Have I got anything else in the chat? Can't see anything. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for your time here today. If you have any further questions, then please reach out to myself or Fay. I understand Fay's put her email address in the chat, so if people want to just grab that, they can then contact her directly. If you'd like to contact me, go to our main website, www.ebwglobal.com, and drop an email at the email there. So that's info@ebwglobal.com, and they will book an appointment in my diary for us to have a conversation if you want one. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being with you. Hope to see you again next month. We have something coming up in May, so we will.
Oh, yeah, we forgot to mention that today, didn't we? Yeah.
Yes, we have, you know, how if successful leaders can avoid the Titanic effect. We're having an interesting discussion on that. Stephen will be joining me, as will Fay Niewiadomski as well. We're doing that on May 16th, Rima?
That's right.
Yep. So on May 16th, look out for that. You will see.
We will send you invitations for that event. Yes.
So thanks again for your time. Much appreciated. Look forward to meeting again online. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.